One of the important qualities of language relates to terminology. Cultural and linguistic anthropologists very often study the structure of language, beginning with, in this case, the morphemes, the combinations of sounds that are applied to important aspects of everyday life. Working in the mid to late 1960s, anthropologist Floyd Lounsbury focused on the importance of kinship terminology in understanding the structure of a language. Lounsbury juxtaposed the specific kinship terms that were applied to relationships in the home to, in this case, the degree and nature of blood and marriage relationships in that household environment. Other anthropologists, such as Pierre Bourdieu and Sally Folk-Moore, have utilized kinship terminology to understand something about the structure of a society, or social structure in this case. They have recognized, Pierre Bourdieu is a very good example of this with regards to his work in North Africa, they've understood the family as being a primary institution in the establishment, growth, and then development of culture. Sally Folk-Moore's work with regards to language highlighted the importance of an anthropological understanding of specific events and how the individuals that are attending those events, the language that they are utilizing or the linguistic traditions that they are utilizing, how that in a sense gives us a better understanding of the surrounding social and cultural landscape. Professor of anthropology Dr. William Beeman, working at the University of Minnesota, focused on the relationship between kinship terminology and social structure when he studied the linguistic traditions of rural Iran. His work, Language, Status, and Power in Iran, published in 1986, studied conversation between rural Persians and how the specific terms and ideas, the specific words and their applications that occurred in these conversations, how this really told us something about interpersonal conduct and the structure of the Persian family. Beeman's diagnostic event related to a marriage feast that occurred while he was conducting his ethnographic field research. And he talked about how in this specific event, in this feasting ritual, he recognized who the members of a Persian lineage was or were, and in this case, the status relationships that existed between them. He writes, status relationships are dependent on the configuration of individuals present at any time or any one time. It becomes vital for individuals engaged in interaction to be able to place themselves and others within some sort of social hierarchy or structure. At the conclusion of his field research, Beeman recognized that the customary practices that he recorded in the home or in the extended household were not restricted to that context or that social context. He recognized that similar kinds of speech and conduct were applied to a variety of social situations outside of the home, but that they were governed, in a sense, by differences in age, sex, and social status. Beeman writes, the pattern of choice in lexical items and social gestures available to a Persian speaker can be seen to map directly onto the system of social differentiation in interaction associated with the surrounding community. This becomes, in a sense, what he refers to as a social constellation of the moment. He takes moments in the home, he takes moments in the town square, in the streets of these small rural communities, and he realizes that by listening to the language that is being applied to specific individuals as they interact with one another, gives him insight into the surrounding culture. It, in a sense, maps out the social landscape that those two individuals are a part of. So language, as it is applied in this case to kinship, becomes a frame of reference for the interaction of social meanings and social values. Building off of Beeman's work, but turning to an urban landscape, we'll take a look at the specific kinship terms and ideas that are applied in modern Tehran. Tehran, as you may or may not know, situated on the Persian Plateau, is a city of over 15 million individuals. It's the center of not just traditional Persian culture and language, but also its many dialects and many cultural interactions. The use of the term Persian in this case relates to Iranian or Tehranian language and culture. Though the commonly spoken language of Tehran is Farsi, several Farsi dialects and Arab Farsi languages are spoken throughout the country of Iran, and we see reflections of those being spoken in this urban landscape as well. Regime change typifies life in modern Tehran. The data that was gathered in preparation for this lecture was drawn from interviews conducted with men who had defected in the late 1970s from Iran to the United States. This defection was the direct result of the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who took power after the revolution in 1979. In 1979, we saw the Shah being overthrown, the unbroken line of kingship that extended back over 2 millennia had come to an end, and a new Islamic government that was not backed by the traditional Iranian military took their position of power. Between 1978 and 1988, the Ayatollah Khomeini was recognized as the leader of the Iranian Republic, and the Shah remained in exile until his death. The individuals who migrated to the United States and who were part of the interview process for this lecture really provided a wealth of information having to do with modern Iranian and Iranian American culture. They focused on the importance of family. They focused on the language applications associated with marriage and social status, and how Tehranian life, in a sense, and the kinship that's associated with many modern Tehranian households really, in a sense, helped to preserve the Persian culture and its language. Let's take a closer look now at what is referred to as the Tehranian Khanadan, or the personal kindred, the landscape of kin relationships that typify an individual's life living in this modern urban landscape. The Khanadan, in a sense, is bilateral in nature. It incorporates the members of 2 different patrilines, or 2 lineages that are bound together by the blood of men. These lineages are referred to as Taifa. So if you are a modern Tehranian speaker, you will recognize or build your personal kindred in a bilateral fashion. You will have your mother's patriline and your father's patriline. Within the Persian system of a personal kindred, there are primary and secondary kinship terms that are applied to individuals and the social relationships that those recounting these relationships have with one another. The kinship terminology that is applied to one's father's patrilineage is organized according to a variety of primary and secondary kinship types. Primary kin types in this case are specific to those which are closest to the individual. So a wife, a son, a daughter, a father, a brother's wife, a sister, and a sister's husband. Then there are secondary or further degree kinship terms or concepts or labels. These would include a father's brother, a father's brother's wife. Right? So all these secondary terms are all associated with either one's mother's or father's Taifa. What we find when we compare the kinship terminology in a primary or secondary context within this personal kindred is that when you move outside of the household, and a household in this case will incorporate a wife, a son, a daughter, a father, a brother, of course the brother's wife, it may have a sister, and if it does, generally it will incorporate a sister's husband. When you move outside of that household, you begin to in a linguistic manner, reduce. And what I mean by that is you begin to apply generic terms to people in that patriline or that taiefa. So within the household, one would refer to one's father as pedar. However, as you move into the patrilineage on the father's side, and you're outside of the household, the father's brother, this would be a paternal uncle, he's referred to as Amu, and his wife, Ame. In the household, a son is referred to as Pesar, but in this case, a father's brother's son or a cousin is Pesar Amu. So in a sense, you're always applying a generic term, in this case, Amu or Ame, depending upon the gender of the individual, in order to link it into a specific individual in the household. So again, secondary or further degree kin terms associated with one's father's patriline are always going to have this generic term that will be linked to them in a sense, and it will reduce the overall terminology that's applied to members of this patriline. This linguistic reduction will become very noticeable to the listener when one begins to move into elder generations. So a father's father's father, so a great-great-grandfather, would be referred to as Jud. Right? And basically, whether you are male or female, everybody beyond that, or even who is part of that generation, will all be referred to as Jod. This linguistically reduces everyone within an individual's great grandparentage to a single term. We do not practice this in our own expression of American Standard English. However, it would be similar to applying the term grandparent to everybody in our grandmother or grandfather's generation and all other relatives that would be related to that grandparent in a sense. It's very generic. It's very much of a reduction process. There are instances, however, when there is a kind of linguistic deletion that occurs. And this has to do with age. So as you refer to your paternal uncle as Amu and his wife as, in this case, Ame, if they are closer to your age, you may not apply that term. So age in this case and age proximity sometimes can reverse the process of linguistic reduction, and this is referred to as linguistic deletion. Let me give you another example of this idea of linguistic deletion. So you refer to your uncle's son, your paternal uncle's son, as Pesar Amu. However, if this individual is older than you are, and again, you're the one recounting your personal kindred, maybe let's say the same age as your paternal uncle, you may drop the Pesar component, or you may delete it in a sense, and just refer to that individual as Amu. So you've literally upgraded the social status of that cousin to one of uncle. It's a little bit confusing, but again, it tells us a lot about the role of, let's say, age in the structure of Persian society. Now let's take our last look here at the taiefa of your mother. So again, we have primary and secondary. The primary would be associated with the household, those members of your mother, well, your mother, and those members of her patrilineage, if there are any within the household. Those would be associated with the primary kinship terms, and then secondary kinship terminology would be applied to members of your mother's taiefa or her patriline outside of the home. specifically males with regard to your mother's taifa. So you'll really be focusing those secondary kinship terms on males with a blood tie to your mother as you rebuild your personal kindred. So we only have, in this case, one primary kin term. This is going to be mother. In Tehranian Farsi, the term mother is, or the word for mother in this case is moder, right? So moder, mother. That's the only primary kin term that will be associated with your maternal taifa. Everything else is secondary or further degree with regards to the kinship terms. So your mother's brother, this would be your maternal uncle, is assigned the kinship term doi, right? So if somebody was to say, who's that individual, and they were pointing to your mother's brother, you would say doi. Your mother's brother's wife is referred to as zan doi. Your mother's brother's son, this would be your cousin, is referred to as pesar doi. Now remember, the same kinds of reducing and deleting concepts can be applied to this taifa. So if that cousin was considerably older than you are, maybe to the level of an uncle status in terms of his overall age, you would most likely drop the expression pasar and refer to this cousin as doi. Now that's deletion again. Then with regards to reduction, well, we see it with the doi expression. So doi, zan doi, pesar doi, that's all reduction. But we also see it with jod again. So once we get to your mother's father's father and that generation, we begin to apply the term jod to everybody, whether they are male or female. So in a sense, these expressions, and again, they might be reducing, they might be deleting, but in a sense, they are distinguishing between the patriline of your father and the patriline of your mother. And I think the best expression of this is in that uncle concept. So you have amu, that would be a linguistic term associated with your father's generation in his patriline, and you have doi, that term or that morpheme that would be applied to your mother's siblings in her patriline. And in this case, the males in each patriline will be the defining units, and then you will then move out from those males and define other kin relationships. But again, they're all funneled through those male blood ties on your father's side, and then those male blood ties on your mother's side. Her patrilineage and your father's patrilineage. Then finally, what we find in this Tehranian example, and it's something that is identical or runs parallel to what William Beeman found in his rural Iranian linguistic studies. These ideas, these terms, things like jod, things like amu, things like doi, right? More amu than doi, these are applied to people of a similar gender, a similar age, and a similar social status in the surrounding community. So you have family that is related to you by blood or by marriage, and then you have honorific terms or family-like honorific terms that you apply to people who are of a similar age, a similar sex, a similar social status in the community that surrounds your household, and that your taifas, both either they're your paternal taifa or your maternal taifa, those taifas that you are a part of, in a sense. So you might look to an elderly gentleman who reminds you of your father's father as Judd, or you might refer to a gentleman who is of your father's age grouping and who reminds you of your paternal uncle as Amu. Even though you may not know this person directly, you will give them that honorific status through the linguistic term that you apply to them, whether you're at the grocery store or you're at a government office. This kind of non-family honorific labeling is rarely seen in our society today. We have slang terms that we apply in different settings. Cousin is one of those terms, or we have honorific kinds of statuses that we apply to people who play the role of an uncle or an aunt. But it's a little bit different from what we see in modern Persia or Iran. In our modern Iranian cultural example, people will literally be treated as an uncle or as a cousin or as an aunt or even as a grandfather or grandmother. And the honorific term that we are applying to them in that Tehranian context is what makes them that status. It's what lifts them up to that family-like status. And that's very, very powerful. One can only imagine what life would be like in an urban setting such as Milwaukee or Chicago or New York or Los Angeles if people applied the same kinds of kinship terms to individuals within the community who reminded them of their father or their mother or their paternal uncle or maternal uncle or a grandparent. It creates a very tightly knit community, one really grounded on trust and blood. So in this case, it is the kinship terminology that gives us real insight into modern Tehranian society, into the social relationships that permeate that society, and into the relationship that exists between the Tehranian household and the surrounding community.